The thunderous roar of twin F-22 Raptor engines split the crystal blue Colorado sky as 50,000 spectators craned their necks skyward at the Thunder and Lightning Air Show. At 15,000 feet above Peterson Space Force Base, the sleek fighter jet performed a maneuver that defied every law of physics the crowd thought they understood. The aircraft seemed to pause mid-air, suspended like a silver bullet against the Rocky Mountain backdrop, before executing a perfect barrel roll so close to the sound barrier that windows rattled in the grandstand below. Colonel Brandon Mitchell stood frozen on the VIP observation deck, his perfectly pressed uniform suddenly feeling too tight around his chest. His pale blue eyes tracked the impossible flight pattern above, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the metal railing. 20 years of military aviation experience told him that what he was witnessing should not be possible with current aircraft capabilities. But something deeper, something that made his stomach turn with a mixture of recognition and dread, told him exactly who was behind those controls. "That's Elena Rodriguez," he whispered, the words barely audible over the crowd's thunderous applause. The same woman he had systematically destroyed 3 years ago at the Air Force Academy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The same cadet he had dismissed with the cruel words that still echoed in his nightmares. Some people are born to serve coffee, not serve their country in the cockpit. Today, Elena would prove that sometimes the most magnificent eagles are forged in the hottest fires of rejection. The F-22 descended toward the runway with a grace that made experienced pilots in the crowd shake their heads in amazement. As the canopy opened and a figure in a flight suit emerged, the public address system crackled to life with an announcement that would change military aviation forever. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Air Force's newest and most decorated F-22 pilot, Captain Elena Rodriguez, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the first pilot in history to achieve perfect scores on all advanced combat maneuvers." Have you ever been told you weren't good enough for your dreams? Have you faced someone who used their power to crush your spirit and convince you that your background determines your destiny? Share your experience in the comments below, because Elena's story will remind you that sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who refuse to accept defeat as final. 3 years earlier, the scorching August heat of Phoenix, Arizona, beat down mercilessly on the cracked concrete of the Greyhound bus station as 20-year-old Elena Rodriguez clutched her grandfather's worn leather compass in her sweaty palm. The antique brass instrument, engraved with mysterious coordinates that had guided her grandfather through the dangerous skies over Nazi Germany as a Tuskegee airman, felt warm against her skin as if it still carried the courage of all the missions it had witnessed. Elena stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with dark brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent, hazel eyes that held a determination far beyond her years. Her faded denim jacket covered a simple white t-shirt that had been washed so many times the fabric felt soft as silk, and her worn sneakers told the story of countless hours spent working double shifts at Rosa's Diner and the all-night gas station on Van Buren Street. In her battered backpack, she carried everything she owned: 3 changes of clothes, a stack of well-read aviation magazines, her grandfather's flight logs from World War II, and a college acceptance letter to Arizona State University that she had never opened because her heart belonged to a different kind of education entirely. Elena had spent the last 2 years working 80-hour weeks, saving every dollar she earned to pay for the preparatory courses required for Air Force Academy admission. While her high school classmates went to parties and football games, she studied physics and mathematics in the break room of whichever job demanded her attention that evening. Her mother, Maria Rodriguez, a single parent who cleaned office buildings downtown, had supported her daughter's impossible dream even when It meant eating rice and beans for weeks at a time so Elena could afford the test preparation materials. The dream itself had been born 12 years earlier when 8-year-old Elena discovered her grandfather's military trunk in the garage of their small rental house. Among the carefully preserved uniforms and commendation letters, she found a photograph of her grandfather standing beside a P-51 Mustang, his face radiating the kind of pride that comes from serving something larger than yourself. That night, Maria had told Elena stories about how her grandfather had fought 2 wars, one against fascism in the skies over Europe, and another against racism here at home, proving that courage and skill mattered more than the color of your skin or the circumstances of your birth. From that moment forward, Elena had known with absolute certainty that she was meant to fly. She spent hours at the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, watching commercial jets take off and land, imagining herself at the controls of something faster and more powerful. She read every book about aviation she could find at the public library, memorized the specifications of military aircraft, and dreamed of the day when she would earn her wings and honor her grandfather's legacy by serving her country in the cockpit of a fighter jet. The journey to the Air Force Academy had been anything but smooth. Elena's grades were excellent, but her family's financial situation meant she couldn't afford the kind of preparatory programs that gave wealthy applicants significant advantages in the highly competitive selection process. She had written her application essays by hand on notebook paper before typing them on an ancient computer at the public library, and her interview suit had come from a thrift store downtown where her mother had carefully selected the most professional outfit their limited budget could afford. When the acceptance letter arrived on a rainy February morning, Elena and her mother had cried together in their tiny kitchen, overwhelmed by the realization that an impossible dream was about to become reality. The letter represented more than just admission to a prestigious institution. It was validation that merit and determination could overcome the disadvantages of growing up poor in America. Elena would be the first person in her family to attend college, let alone one of the most elite military academies in the world. The bus ride from Phoenix to Colorado Springs took 14 hours, and Elena spent most of that time staring out the window at the changing landscape while her grandfather's compass rested in her lap. As the desert gave way to mountains and the terrain became more dramatic, she felt as though she was traveling not just to a different state, but to a completely different world where her background and circumstances would finally stop mattering more than her abilities and dreams. She had prepared for the academic challenges that awaited her at the academy. Her math and science scores were in the top percentile, and she had spent months studying military history and aviation theory to ensure she could compete with classmates who had attended expensive preparatory schools. What she hadn't prepared for was the social dynamics that would prove far more dangerous than any academic requirement. Elena's first glimpse of the Air Force Academy came as the bus wound through the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, and the sight of the massive campus spread across nearly 18,000 acres of Colorado landscape took her breath away. The modern architecture of the Cadet Chapel, with its distinctive triangular spires reaching toward the sky, seemed to embody everything she had dreamed about, a place where excellence was pursued without compromise, where the best and brightest came together to serve something greater than themselves. As Elena stepped off the bus at the Colorado Springs terminal, her grandfather's compass seemed to grow warmer in her hand, its needle pointing steadily northward toward the academy and the future she had worked so hard to reach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The thin mountain air felt crisp and clean in her lungs, so different from the dusty heat of Phoenix, and she interpreted it as a sign that she was finally where she belonged. The taxi ride to the academy gates cost Elena $43. Nearly half of the money she had saved for miscellaneous expenses during her first semester. As they approached the imposing entrance with its stone eagles and American flags, Elena felt her heart racing with a combination of excitement and nervousness that made her grip her grandfather's compass even tighter. She was about to begin the most challenging chapter of her life, surrounded by some of the most privileged and well-connected young people in America, and armed with nothing but her determination and the legacy of courage that ran in her bloodline. The driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and weathered hands, glanced at Elena in his rearview mirror as they pulled up to the academy gates. "First time?" he asked, and when Elena nodded, he smiled and added, "My nephew graduated from here 5 years ago. Told me it was the hardest thing he ever did, but also the most rewarding. You've got that look in your eyes, kid. You're going to do just fine." As Elena paid the fare and gathered her simple belongings, she had no way of knowing that her arrival had already been noted by people who would see her presence as a threat to the established order. She couldn't have imagined that within hours of stepping onto the academy grounds, she would encounter a man whose privilege and prejudice would lead him to wage a systematic campaign designed to destroy not just her military career, but her very sense of self-worth. Elena Rodriguez walked through the academy gates carrying her grandfather's compass, her mother's love, and an unshakable belief that the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. She was about to discover that some battles are fought not in the air, but on the ground, against enemies who use their power to determine who gets the chance to soar and who gets told they were never meant to fly at all. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the academy's pristine grounds as Elena made her way toward the dormitory complex, her worn sneakers silent on the polished concrete walkways. Around her, other new cadets moved with the confidence of people who had always known they would end up in places like this, their expensive luggage and casual conversations about family connections and preparatory school experiences creating an atmosphere of privilege that felt as foreign to Elena as a different planet. She clutched the small piece of paper with her room assignment and tried to project the same confidence she saw in her fellow cadets, but inside her stomach churned with the growing realization that she was about to face challenges that had nothing to do with academic requirements or physical fitness standards. The real test would be whether a girl from Phoenix whose mother cleaned buildings for a living could find her place among the sons and daughters of generals, senators, and Fortune 500 executives. Elena's grandfather's compass seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm, reminding her that she carried the courage of generations who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. As she approached the doors of her new life, she whispered a quiet promise to the memory of the Tuskegee Airmen whose legacy had brought her this far. She would earn her wings, no matter what obstacles awaited her inside those intimidating buildings. The automatic doors of Vandenberg Hall slid open with a soft whisper, and Elena Rodriguez stepped across the threshold into a world that would test every ounce of strength, determination, and resilience she possessed. Behind her, the Colorado sun began its descent toward the Rocky Mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded her of the Arizona sunsets she had left behind. Ahead of her lay a future that would prove whether dreams, forged in diners and gas stations, could survive in the rarefied air of America's most elite military institution. Elena's first night at the Air Force Academy was spent lying awake in her narrow dormitory bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new environment, and feeling the weight of expectations pressing down on her chest like a physical force. Through the thin walls, she could hear her roommate, Victoria Sterling, talking on her phone in hushed tones about country club memberships and family vacation homes in Aspen, conversations that reminded Elena just how different her world had been from the lives of her fellow cadets. The dormitory room itself was spartanly furnished with 2 single beds, 2 desks, and 2 small closets that seemed inadequate for storing much more than the basic necessities. Elena had unpacked her few belongings in less than 10 minutes. her 3 changes of civilian clothes hanging forlornly in a closet designed to accommodate a much more extensive wardrobe. Victoria's side of the room, by contrast, was filled with expensive luggage, designer athletic wear, and framed photographs of family gatherings that looked like something from a magazine advertisement for the American dream. As Alina stared at the ceiling in the darkness, her grandfather's compass resting on the knitstand beside her bed, she thought about all the nights she had worked until dawn at Rose's diner, serving coffee and eggs to truck drivers and insomniacs, while dreaming of the day when she would be here, finally pursuing the career that had called to her since childhood. The contrast between those fluorescent-lit nights and this pristine military environment felt almost surreal, as if she had somehow stepped through a portal into a completely different existence. The morning alarm at 05:00 hours jolted Alina from a restless sleep filled with dreams of flying and falling in equal measure. Around her, the dormitory came alive with the sounds of dozens of young people beginning their first full day as Air Force Academy cadets, and Alina felt her stomach flutter with a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she realized that everything she had worked toward was about to begin in earnest. The first challenge came during the communal shower facilities, where Alina's simple toiletries and drugstore soap felt embarrassingly inadequate compared to the expensive skincare products and professional-grade athletic gear that surrounded her. She completed her morning routine as quickly as possible, trying to ignore the conversations about spring break trips to Europe and summer internships at family companies that reminded her how different her background was from those of her peers. Breakfast in the cadet dining hall was Alina's first real taste of the social dynamics that would define her experience at the academy. The massive room buzzed with conversation as hundreds of cadets filled their trays and found seats at long tables arranged with military precision. Alina moved through the lines slowly, overwhelmed by the variety of food available and the casual way her fellow cadets discussed choices that would have been luxuries in her household growing up. She found an empty seat at a table near the windows, overlooking the parade grounds, hoping to eat quietly while observing the interactions around her and getting a sense of the social landscape she would need to navigate. Her plan for anonymity was quickly disrupted when Victoria Sterling approached with a group of other cadets, their conversation loud enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "Alina, right?" Victoria said, settling into the seat across from her with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about where you belong. "I was telling everyone about my new roommate from Arizona. It's so interesting to meet someone from such a different background. I bet this is all quite overwhelming for you." The comment was delivered with a smile that didn't reach Victoria's eyes, and Alina felt the familiar sensation of being marked as different, as someone whose presence required explanation or justification. She had experienced similar moments throughout her life, situations where well-meaning people made assumptions about her capabilities or circumstances based on superficial observations, but somehow it felt more intense here, where belonging meant everything, and exclusion could derail dreams that had taken years to build. "I'm adjusting well, thank you," Alina replied evenly, taking a bite of her oatmeal and trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. "The academy is everything. I hoped it would be." Victoria's smile became more pronounced as she exchanged glances with her companions, a subtle communication that Alina recognized as the beginning of something she wouldn't enjoy. "That's wonderful. I'm sure you'll find your place here eventually. It just takes some people longer than others to adapt to this kind of environment." The conversation continued around Alina as Victoria and her friends discussed their summer plans and family connections, with casual references to influence and opportunity that made Alina feel like an observer watching a foreign culture from the outside. She finished her breakfast quickly and excused herself, claiming a need to review class schedules, but really seeking escape from the suffocating atmosphere of casual exclusion that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Elena's first academic classes provided a welcome relief from the social challenges of dormitory life. In mathematics and physics, her preparation and natural ability allowed her to compete on equal footing with classmates who had attended the most prestigious preparatory schools in the country. Her professors seemed impressed by her analytical skills and her willingness to ask thoughtful questions, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, Elena felt like she belonged somewhere. The relief was short-lived. During her first military science class, Elena encountered the man who would become the primary obstacle between her and her dreams of becoming a fighter pilot. Colonel Brandon Mitchell entered the classroom with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. His perfectly pressed uniform adorned with ribbons and insignia that spoke of a distinguished career in military aviation. Mitchell was tall and imposing, with prematurely gray hair that made him look distinguished rather than old, and pale blue eyes that seemed to assess everything and everyone with the calculating precision of a predator, evaluating potential prey. His family's military legacy stretched back 4 generations, and his personal wealth, inherited from a grandfather who had made a fortune in defense contracting, gave him connections and influence that extended far beyond his official rank and position. As Mitchell began his lecture on the principles of military leadership, Elena found herself captivated by his obvious expertise and commanding presence. Here was someone who had actually flown combat missions, who had experienced the reality of military aviation at the highest levels, and who could provide the kind of guidance and mentorship that could help her achieve her goals. She took careful notes and asked intelligent questions, hoping to make a positive impression that might lead to opportunities for additional learning and development. The class proceeded smoothly until Mitchell began discussing the qualities required for success in military aviation. His initial comments were standard and inspiring, emphasizing the importance of dedication, skill, and courage in serving the country through aerial combat. But as he continued, his tone began to shift in ways that made Elena increasingly uncomfortable. Military aviation, Mitchell said, his gaze sweeping across the classroom with particular intensity, requires a particular type of person, someone who understands instinctively what it means to lead, to make decisions under pressure, and to represent the finest traditions of American military excellence. These qualities aren't something you can learn from textbooks or acquire through hard work alone. They're inherent characteristics that some people possess and others simply don't. Elena felt a chill run down her spine as Mitchell's eyes seemed to linger on her for a moment longer than seemed appropriate. There was something in his expression that reminded her of the condescending looks she had received from Victoria at breakfast, a kind of assessment that went beyond academic or professional evaluation and into territory that felt personal and judgmental. The Air Force Academy, Mitchell continued, has a responsibility to identify those individuals who possess the natural leadership, qualities necessary for success in military aviation, and to guide them toward positions where they can serve their country most effectively. This sometimes means making difficult decisions about who belongs in advanced programs and who might be better suited for other forms of service. The implication was clear, even if Mitchell's words remained technically professional and appropriate. Elena felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment as she realized that her first impression of potential mentorship had been naive and misguided. This man had already decided something about her based on factors that had nothing to do with her abilities or qualifications, and she could sense that her time at the academy was about to become much more challenging than she had anticipated. After class, Elena lingered in the hallway, hoping for an opportunity to speak with Mitchell privately and perhaps clarify any misunderstandings about her capabilities or commitment. She had dealt with skeptical authority figures before, and she had usually been able to win them over through demonstration of her work ethic and competence. When Mitchell finally emerged from the classroom, Elena approached him with the respectful confidence she had practiced throughout her working Life. Colonel Mitchell, she said, falling into step beside him as he walked toward his office. I wanted to thank you for an excellent lecture today. I'm particularly interested in learning more about the qualities you mentioned for success in military aviation. I'd appreciate any guidance you might be able to provide about advanced programs and opportunities for additional training. Mitchell stopped walking and turned to face Elena with an expression that was polite but unmistakably dismissive. Up close, she could see that his eyes were completely cold, lacking any warmth or encouragement that might have indicated genuine interest in helping a promising cadet develop her potential. Miss Rodriguez, he said, pronouncing her name with just enough emphasis to make it sound foreign and out of place. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I think it's important for you to have realistic expectations about your future here at the Academy. Military aviation programs are extremely competitive, and they require candidates who can not only meet technical requirements, but also demonstrate the kind of natural leadership and cultural fit that our tradition demands. Elena felt her grandfather's compass growing warm in her pocket, and she drew strength from the knowledge that she carried the legacy of someone who had faced prejudice and overcome it through excellence and determination. I understand the competition, sir, and I'm prepared to work as hard as necessary to prove my capabilities. My academic performance and physical fitness scores indicate that I can meet any technical requirements, and I'm confident that I can demonstrate leadership qualities through action rather than just words. Mitchell's smile was thin and condescending, the kind of expression that adults use when humoring children who don't understand how the world really works. Miss Rodriguez, success in military aviation isn't just about meeting minimum requirements or working hard. It requires a certain kind of instinctive understanding of military culture and traditions that some people possess naturally and others spend years trying to acquire without success. I'd hate to see you waste time pursuing goals that might not be realistic given your particular background and circumstances. The words hit Elena like a physical blow, not because they were particularly harsh, but because they carried the weight of institutional authority and the implicit threat that her dreams could be crushed by someone who had already decided she didn't belong. She had expected to face challenges at the Academy, but she had assumed they would be related to academic or physical performance, areas where her preparation and determination could make a difference. The realization that she would be fighting against predetermined judgments based on her background was both infuriating and terrifying. I appreciate your concern, sir, Elena replied, working to keep her voice steady and professional despite the anger building in her chest, but I think my performance will speak for itself. I'm here because I earned my place through qualification and merit, and I intend to prove that those are the only things that matter. Mitchell's expression shifted slightly, and Elena caught a glimpse of something calculating and potentially dangerous in his pale eyes. Of course, Miss Rodriguez. I'm sure you'll find your appropriate place here at the Academy. The institution has a way of guiding people toward roles where they can best serve their country, regardless of their personal preferences or ambitions. As Mitchell walked away, Elena stood alone in the hallway, feeling as though she had just received a declaration of war disguised as friendly advice. She understood instinctively that she had made an enemy of someone who possessed both the authority and the inclination to make her life at the Academy extremely difficult, and she felt the first stirrings of fear about whether her determination and abilities would be sufficient to overcome systematic opposition from within the institution itself. That evening, Elena sat alone in the dormitory common room, surrounded by her grandfather's flight logs and a collection of aviation magazines she had carefully preserved throughout her journey to the Academy. The leather-bound journals contained detailed accounts of combat missions over Europe during World War II, written in her grandfather's careful handwriting and filled with technical observations about aircraft performance, weather conditions, and tactical decisions that had meant the difference between life and death at 30,000 feet. Reading through the familiar pages provided Elena with comfort and inspiration during this first difficult day, reminding her of the legacy she carried and the dreams that had sustained her through years of working multiple jobs and sacrificing social opportunities for academic excellence. Her grandfather had faced prejudice and discrimination that made her current challenges seem manageable by comparison, and he had overcome them through skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to proving that ability mattered more than background or social acceptance. The flight logs also contain detailed sketches of aircraft configurations and performance modifications that demonstrated her grandfather's deep understanding of aviation technology and his innovative approach to solving technical problems. Elena had studied these drawings countless times throughout her childhood, using them to develop her own understanding of aerodynamics and aircraft systems that would serve her well in advanced flight training programs. As she turned the pages, Elena's fingers traced the coordinates her grandfather had carefully recorded for each mission, navigation points that had guided him safely through enemy territory and back to friendly airfields. These same coordinates were engraved on the compass that now rested in her pocket, creating a tangible connection between her current struggles and the courage that had carried her grandfather through far more dangerous challenges. The common room was mostly empty, with most cadets either studying in their rooms or participating in evening activities that Elena felt too emotionally drained to join. The solitude gave her time to process the day's events and to formulate a strategy for dealing with Colonel Mitchell's obvious hostility without compromising her ultimate goals. She had faced skeptical authority figures before, but never in a context where so much depended on gaining their approval and support. Elena's concentration was interrupted by the arrival of Tyler Washington, a fellow cadet from her military science class, who had observed the tension between her and Colonel Mitchell during the afternoon lecture. Tyler was a tall, athletic young man from Detroit whose easy smile and genuine warmth had already made him popular among their classmates, and Elena had noticed that he seemed to navigate the Academy's social dynamics with a confidence that came from understanding both privilege and struggle. "Mind if I join you?" Tyler asked, gesturing toward the empty chair across from Alana's study materials. "You looked pretty deep in thought during Mitchell's class today, and I thought you might want to talk about it." Elena hesitated, uncertain whether she could trust someone she had known for less than 24 hours with her concerns about Colonel Mitchell's attitude and the challenges she was already facing at the academy. But Tyler's expression was genuinely concerned rather than curious, and she sensed that he might understand her situation better than most of their fellow cadets. "I'm fine," Elena replied, then immediately realized how unconvincing that sounded. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. I think I might have gotten off on the wrong foot with Colonel Mitchell, and I'm not sure how to recover from it." Tyler settled into the chair and glanced around the common room to ensure they had privacy before responding. "Elena, I don't think you got off on the wrong foot with Mitchell. I think Mitchell decided something about you before you ever opened your mouth, and nothing you said was going to change his mind." The observation was both perceptive and troubling, confirming Elena's own suspicions about the afternoon's encounter while raising questions about how obvious Mitchell's bias had been to other observers. If Tyler had noticed the inappropriate nature of Mitchell's comments, it was likely that other cadets had as well, which could either provide Elena with potential allies or make her situation more embarrassing and difficult to navigate. "What makes you say that?" Elena asked, closing her grandfather's flight log and giving Tyler her full attention. Tyler leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "My father is a retired Air Force colonel, and I grew up around guys like Mitchell. They have very specific ideas about who belongs in military aviation and who doesn't, and those ideas usually have more to do with family connections and social background than actual qualifications or ability. Elena felt a mixture of relief and disappointment at Tyler's words. Relief because someone else had recognized the unfairness of Mitchell's attitude, but disappointment because it confirmed that her challenges were likely to be more significant and systemic than she had hoped. "So what do you suggest? Do I just accept that I'm going to have to deal with this kind of attitude throughout my time here?" "Absolutely not," Tyler replied with conviction that surprised Elena. "You deal with it by being so good that they can't ignore you, and by finding allies who will support you when Mitchell tries to undermine your progress. There are plenty of instructors and administrators here who care more about ability than background, and there are cadets who will stand up for what's right when the time comes." Tyler's confidence was infectious, and Elena felt some of her earlier despair beginning to lift as she considered the possibility that Mitchell's hostility didn't have to define her experience at the academy. She had overcome obstacles before, through persistence and excellence, and there was no reason to believe that this situation would be fundamentally different. "Tell me about your grandfather," Tyler said, noticing the flight logs spread across the table. "Those look like original World War II documents." Elena's face brightened as she opened one of the journals to a page containing detailed sketches of P-51 Mustang modifications. He was a Tuskegee airman, flew escort missions for bomber squadrons over Europe. He never talked much about the combat, but he kept detailed records of everything he learned about flying and aircraft performance. Tyler examined the sketches with obvious admiration, tracing the careful technical drawings with his finger. "These are incredible. Your grandfather was documenting performance modifications that became standard throughout the Air Force. This kind of innovation and attention to detail is exactly what military aviation needs. He used to tell me that flying wasn't just about having steady hands or good reflexes," Elena continued, warming to a subject that connected her current struggles to her deepest sources of motivation. "He said it was about understanding your aircraft so completely that you could make it do things the engineers never intended, and about having the courage to push beyond what other people thought was possible. That's exactly the kind of thinking that will set you apart here," Tyler said. "Mitchell and people like him want pilots who follow procedures and respect hierarchy. But the military actually needs innovators who can adapt to situations that aren't covered in any manual. Your grandfather's approach to flying is much more valuable than Mitchell's approach to leadership." Elena felt her confidence returning as she realized that Tyler understood not just her current challenges, but also the deeper significance of her goals and the legacy she was trying to honor. Having an ally who could see past the surface differences that seemed to matter so much to people like Colonel Mitchell gave her hope that the academy might still provide the opportunities she had dreamed about for so many years. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Victoria Sterling and several of her friends, who entered the common room with the casual entitlement that Elena was beginning to recognize as characteristic of a certain subset of their class. Victoria's eyes immediately focused on the flight logs spread across the table, and Elena could see her calculating how to use this information in some way that would reinforce social hierarchies and demonstrate her own superiority. "How interesting," Victoria said, approaching the table without invitation and examining the documents with theatrical curiosity. "Are these your family papers, Elena? They look so old and authentic. It must be fascinating to have such a direct connection to military history, even if it's from such a long time ago." Elena felt her jaw tighten at Victoria's condescending tone, but Tyler intervened before she could respond in a way that might escalate the situation unnecessarily. "Elena's grandfather was a Tuskegee airman," he said firmly. "These documents represent some of the most important innovations in World War II aviation technology." Victoria's smile became more pronounced as she realized she had found an opportunity to demonstrate her own knowledge and connections. "Oh, the Tuskegee Airmen. Yes, I wrote a paper about them in prep school. Such an interesting experiment in military integration." My grandfather actually worked with some of the administrative aspects of that program when he was at the Pentagon. The comet was carefully constructed to diminish the significance of Elena's grandfather's service, while simultaneously establishing Victoria's own family's superior position within military hierarchy. Elena felt her anger building, but she also recognized that responding emotionally would only give Victoria and her friends more ammunition for their campaign of subtle undermining. "It wasn't an experiment," Elena said quietly, her voice controlled but firm. "It was a demonstration that excellence has nothing to do with background, and everything to do with skill, determination, and courage." Victoria's friends exchanged glances that suggested they found Elena's response amusing rather than compelling. And Elena realized that she was fighting a battle she couldn't win through direct confrontation. These people had spent their entire lives in environments where social positioning mattered more than individual merit, and they possessed advantages that went far beyond anything she could counter through academic performance or personal achievement. "Of course," Victoria replied with false agreement. "I'm sure your grandfather was very skilled. It's just that military aviation has become so much more complex since then. Modern fighter pilots need to understand systems and technologies that didn't exist during World War II, and they need to be able to integrate seamlessly with military culture and traditions that require a certain kind of instinctive understanding." Elena recognized the echo of Colonel Mitchell's earlier comments in Victoria's words, and she realized that the campaign against her acceptance at the academy was likely to be coordinated and systematic rather than simply the result of one prejudiced instructor's personal bias. The prospect of facing organized opposition from both authority figures and fellow cadets was daunting, but it also clarified the stakes involved and the level of performance that would be required to overcome their efforts. "You're absolutely right about the complexity of modern aviation," Elena replied, carefully keeping her tone neutral and professional. "That's why I'm here to learn everything I can about advanced systems and technologies. I'm sure my grandfather would be fascinated by how much the field has evolved since his time." Tyler nodded approvingly at Elena's diplomatic response, while Victoria seemed slightly disappointed that her provocation hadn't produced a more dramatic reaction. After a few more minutes of superficial conversation, Victoria and her friends moved on to other activities, leaving Elena and Tyler alone to continue their discussion. "You handled that well," Tyler said once they were gone. "Victoria was trying to get you to lose your temper so she could use it as evidence that you don't have the emotional control necessary for military aviation. By staying calm and professional, you denied her the reaction she was looking for." Elena nodded, but inside she felt exhausted by the constant need to prove herself worthy of basic respect and consideration. "This is going to be a long 4 years if every interaction is a test of whether I belong here." "It doesn't have to be," Tyler replied. "The key is to focus on the people and opportunities that matter, and not to waste energy fighting battles that don't advance your goals." Mitchell and Victoria represent one perspective within the academy, but they're not the only perspective, and they're definitely not the final word on who succeeds here. As Elena packed up her grandfather's flight logs and prepared to return to her room, she felt a mixture of determination and apprehension about the challenges ahead. Tyler's support and insight had helped her understand that her struggles were part of a larger pattern of institutional bias rather than personal failings on her part. But they had also made clear that overcoming these challenges would require strategic thinking and political awareness in addition to academic and physical excellence. Before leaving the common room, Elena pulled her grandfather's compass from her pocket and checked its bearing. The needle pointed steadily north, toward the Academy's airfield and the flight training facilities where she hoped to prove that her dreams were worth pursuing regardless of the obstacles placed in her path. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate her capabilities, and she was determined to honor her grandfather's legacy by refusing to let prejudice and privilege determine her destiny. The next morning brought Elena's first encounter with the Academy's Flight Simulation Laboratory, a state-of-the-art facility that represented everything she had dreamed about during her years of preparation and sacrifice. The building itself was impressive, with sleek lines and modern architecture that suggested the kind of advanced technology and unlimited resources that made the Academy one of the premier military training institutions in the world. As Elena approached the entrance, her grandfather's compass seemed to grow warm in her pocket, as if responding to the proximity of the aircraft and flight systems that had called to her since childhood. The simulation lab was filled with sophisticated equipment that replicated the cockpit environments of various military aircraft, from basic trainers to advanced fighter jets like the F-22 Raptor that represented the pinnacle of American aviation technology. Elena moved through the facility with barely contained excitement, examining each simulator and imagining herself at the controls, finally pursuing the career that had sustained her through years of doubt and financial struggle. Her enthusiasm was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Brandon Mitchell, who entered the simulation lab with the commanding presence that had impressed Elena during their first-class encounter. Today, however, she was prepared for his condescending attitude and determined to demonstrate her capabilities rather than simply hoping for fair treatment and encouragement. Mitchell was accompanied by a small group of senior cadets who served as teaching assistants, including several who Elena recognized from Victoria Sterling's social circle. "Good morning, cadets," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying easily across the large room and commanding immediate attention from the dozen first-year students who had been selected for this introductory flight simulation session. "Today you will have your first opportunity to experience military aviation through our advanced simulation systems. This exercise will help us evaluate your natural aptitude for flight operations and your potential for advanced training programs." Elena felt her heart racing with anticipation as Mitchell explained the procedures for the simulation exercise. Each cadet would spend 30 minutes in a basic flight trainer simulator, performing a series of standard maneuvers that would test their spatial orientation, hand-eye coordination, and ability to process multiple sources of information simultaneously. The exercise was designed to identify candidates with exceptional natural ability who might be suitable for accelerated training programs. As Mitchell continued his briefing, Elena noticed that his gaze lingered on certain cadets with obvious approval while passing over others with barely concealed dismissal. When his eyes met hers, she saw the same calculating coldness that had characterized their previous encounters, and she realized that this exercise would be as much about confirming Mitchell's predetermined judgments as about objectively evaluating student performance. "The simulation scenarios you will experience today," Mitchell continued, "are based on actual training protocols used throughout the Air Force. Your performance will be recorded and analyzed, using the same criteria applied to pilot candidates at advanced training bases around the country. This means that your results today could have significant implications for your future opportunities within military aviation." Elena understood the implicit threat in Mitchell's words. This wasn't just an educational exercise, but a gatekeeping mechanism that could determine whether she would have access to the advanced training programs necessary for becoming a fighter pilot. Mitchell had the authority to interpret her performance in ways that could either open doors or close them permanently, and she suspected that he had already decided which outcome he preferred. The first several cadets to use the simulators were friends and associates of Victoria Sterling, young men and women whose family connections and expensive preparatory educations had given them exposure to flight training that most of their classmates lacked. Elena watched their performances carefully, noting that while they demonstrated competence and confidence, their actual skill levels seemed modest compared to what she had observed in video demonstrations of advanced pilot training. When Victoria's turn came, she approached the simulator with the casual confidence that characterized all of her interactions at the Academy. Her performance was smooth and professional, demonstrating familiarity with aircraft controls and procedures that suggested significant previous experience with flight training. Mitchell observed her session with obvious approval, making positive comments about her natural instincts and technical competence that stood in marked contrast to his neutral or negative observations about other cadets' performances. "Excellent work, Miss Sterling," Mitchell announced as Victoria completed her simulation session. "Your control inputs are precise, and your situational awareness is outstanding. This kind of natural ability is exactly what we look for in candidates for advanced fighter pilot training programs." Elena felt her stomach tighten as she realized that Mitchell was establishing a standard of evaluation that seemed to favor cadets with previous experience and financial advantages over those who were encountering flight simulators for the first time. The exercise was supposedly designed to measure natural aptitude, but it was actually rewarding preparation and opportunity that had nothing to do with inherent ability or potential for development. When Tyler Washington's turn came, Elena was relieved to see that Mitchell's evaluation seemed more fair and objective. Tyler's performance was genuinely impressive, demonstrating quick learning and excellent hand-eye coordination that earned him positive comments even from the teaching assistants who had shown obvious favoritism toward their social connections. Mitchell's assessment was professional and encouraging, suggesting that Tyler might be an excellent candidate for advanced training programs. As Elena's turn approached, she felt her nervousness increasing despite her confidence in her preparation and abilities. She had spent countless hours studying aircraft systems and flight procedures, and she had practiced spatial orientation exercises using computer simulations and visualization techniques. But she also understood that her performance would be evaluated by someone who had already demonstrated bias against her and who possessed the authority to interpret her results in ways that could derail her military aviation aspirations. "Miss Rodriguez," Mitchell called, his tone carefully neutral but somehow managing to convey skepticism about her likely performance. "You're next. Please take your position in Simulator 3 and we'll begin your evaluation." Elena approached the simulator with outward calm that concealed her internal mixture of excitement and anxiety. The cockpit environment was more sophisticated than anything she had experienced during her preparation, with multiple display screens, complex control systems, and realistic physical sensations that made the simulation feel almost like actual flight. As she strapped herself into the pilot's seat and began familiarizing herself with the controls, Elena felt her grandfather's compass growing warm against her leg, and she drew strength from the knowledge that she carried the legacy of someone who had excelled under pressure far more intense than anything she would face today. The simulation scenario began with basic aircraft startup procedures, and Elena moved through the required checklist with careful precision, double-checking each step and ensuring that all systems were properly configured before advancing to the next phase of the exercise. Her movements were deliberate and confident, reflecting the thoroughness of her preparation and her respect for the complexity and danger inherent in aviation operations. As the scenario progressed to actual flight maneuvers, Elena felt a sense of natural connection with the aircraft systems that surprised even her. The control inputs felt intuitive and responsive, and she found herself anticipating the aircraft's behavior in ways that allowed her to make smooth, precise adjustments that maintained perfect flight parameters throughout increasingly complex maneuvers. Her spatial orientation remained clear and accurate even during aggressive turns and altitude changes, and she demonstrated the kind of situational awareness that distinguished exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. Elena's performance during the emergency procedures portion of the simulation was particularly impressive. When the computer introduced a simulated engine failure at a critical phase of flight, she responded immediately with textbook procedures while maintaining aircraft control and communication protocols that would have been essential in a real emergency situation. Her calm, methodical approach to crisis management demonstrated exactly the kind of temperament and competence that military aviation demanded. As Alina completed the simulation exercise and began shutdown procedures, she felt confident that her performance had been exceptional by any objective standard. She had demonstrated technical competence, natural ability, and the kind of cool-headed decision-making that characterize successful military pilots. The teaching assistants who had observed her session were exchanging glances that suggested they had been impressed by what they had witnessed, and even Mitchell's expression seemed to reflect grudging acknowledgement of her capabilities. "Interesting performance, Miss Rodriguez," Mitchell said as Alina climbed out of the simulator, his tone carefully controlled, but somehow managing to convey disappointment rather than approval. "Your technical execution was adequate, though I noticed some hesitation during critical decision points that might indicate uncertainty about procedures or lack of confidence in high-pressure situations." Alina felt her face flush with anger and disbelief as she realized that Mitchell was deliberately mischaracterizing her performance in ways that created negative impressions about her suitability for advanced training. The hesitation he mentioned had actually been careful consideration of available options during emergency procedures, the kind of thoughtful analysis that prevented rash decisions and catastrophic mistakes. "I was following standard emergency protocols, sir," Alina replied, working to keep her voice professional despite her outrage at Mitchell's unfair assessment. "I believe careful evaluation of available options is preferable to impulsive reactions during crisis situations." Mitchell's smile was thin and condescending, and Alina could see that he had been hoping for exactly this kind of defensive response that he could interpret as evidence of her inappropriate attitude and lack of respect for authority. "Miss Rodriguez, military aviation requires pilots who can make quick decisions based on training and instinct rather than academic analysis. The kind of deliberative approach you demonstrated today might be suitable for civilian flying or transport operations, but it's not what we need in combat aviation." Alina felt her grandfather's compass growing warm in her pocket, and she drew strength from the knowledge that her assessment of her own performance was accurate, regardless of Mitchell's attempts to distort it for his own purposes. She had flown the simulation with exactly the kind of precision and judgment that her grandfather's flight logs had taught her to value, and she refused to let Mitchell's prejudice convince her that excellence was somehow inadequate. "I understand, sir," Alina replied, keeping her tone respectful but firm. "I appreciate the feedback and I'll work on developing quicker decision-making reflexes during future training exercises." Mitchell nodded with obvious satisfaction at what he interpreted as acknowledgement of legitimate criticism rather than diplomatic management of an unfair situation. "Excellent attitude, Miss Rodriguez. This kind of self-awareness and willingness to accept guidance will serve you well as you find your appropriate role within the Air Force structure." As Alina left the simulation laboratory, she felt a mixture of pride in her actual performance and frustration with Mitchell's deliberate misrepresentation of her capabilities. Tyler Washington caught up with her in the hallway, his expression reflecting his own outrage at what he had witnessed during her evaluation. "That was complete bullshit," Tyler said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard by other cadets or faculty members. "Your simulation performance was better than anyone else's, including Victoria's. Mitchell is deliberately sabotaging your evaluation because he's already decided you don't belong here." Alina nodded, grateful for Tyler's support but also concerned about the implications of Mitchell's obvious bias for her future at the academy. "What do I do about it?" "I can't exactly file a complaint against a senior faculty member based on my feeling that his evaluation was unfair." "You document everything," Tyler replied with conviction. "You keep records of every interaction, every evaluation, and every example of differential treatment. And you perform so well in every other context that his bias becomes obvious too. Everyone else who matters Elena felt some of her discouragement lifting as she considered Tyler's advice. Mitchell might have the authority to influence her immediate training opportunities, but he wasn't the only person at the academy who would evaluate her progress and potential. If she could demonstrate excellence in other contexts while carefully documenting instances of unfair treatment, she might be able to build a case that would eventually overcome Mitchell's attempts to derail her career. That evening, Elena sat in her dormitory room writing detailed notes about the day's simulation exercise, recording not just Mitchell's comments, but also the specific aspects of her performance that had been impressive and the ways in which his evaluation had mischaracterized her actual capabilities. Her grandfather's compass rested on the desk beside her notebook, its steady bearing toward true north, reminding her that staying focused on her goals was more important than getting distracted by the obstacles that people like Mitchell placed in her path. As Elena prepared for bed, she felt a renewed sense of determination about her future at the academy. Mitchell's hostility was real and potentially dangerous, but it was also revealing something important about the institutional challenges that capable people faced when they threatened established hierarchies and conventional assumptions. By continuing to excel despite his attempts at undermining, Elena would not only pursue her own dreams, but also demonstrate that excellence belonged to those who earned it rather than those who inherited it. The systematic campaign against Elena Rodriguez began subtly during her third week at the academy, with small incidents that individually seemed like coincidences or misunderstandings, but collectively created a pattern of deliberate exclusion designed to undermine her confidence and academic performance. Colonel Mitchell had enlisted the cooperation of several teaching assistants and influential cadets who shared his philosophy about maintaining traditional hierarchies within military aviation, and their coordinated efforts created an environment of constant psychological pressure that would have broken less determined students. Elena's first indication that something organized was happening came during a routine aerodynamics lecture when she discovered that the required reading assignment had been changed without notice. While her classmates discussed complex theoretical concepts that had apparently been covered in supplementary materials, Elena found herself struggling to follow conversations about topics that weren't included in any of the textbooks or handouts she had received. When she approached the teaching assistant after class to ask about the missing materials, she was told that all assignment changes had been posted on the course bulletin board and that it was her responsibility to check for updates regularly. The bulletin board, however, contained no record of the assignment change, and Elena realized that information was being distributed through informal channels that deliberately excluded students who weren't part of the established social networks. Victoria Sterling and her associates received updates through family connections and social gatherings that Elena couldn't access, creating an information advantage that translated into better academic performance and more opportunities for recognition and advancement. Elena's response was to become obsessively vigilant about checking multiple sources for course information, spending hours each evening reviewing online databases, comparing notes with classmates who were willing to share information, and visiting faculty offices during designated hours to ensure she hadn't missed any important announcements or requirements. The additional time and energy required for this basic academic housekeeping meant that she had less opportunity for the extracurricular activities and social networking that were equally important for success at the academy. The exclusion tactics escalated during Elena's fourth week when she arrived at the flight simulation laboratory to find that her scheduled training session had been canceled due to equipment maintenance issues that somehow didn't affect the session scheduled immediately before and after her time slot. When Elena checked with the facility supervisor, she was told that the cancellation had been communicated through proper channels and that missed sessions couldn't be rescheduled due to the heavy demand for simulator time. Tyler Washington, who had been scheduled for the session immediately following Elena's canceled appointment, confirmed that his training had proceeded normally and that no equipment problems had been evident during his time in the simulator. The pattern was becoming clear. Elena was being systematically denied access to the advanced training opportunities that were essential for demonstrating her qualifications for fighter pilot programs. Elena's academic performance remained exceptional. Despite these obstacles, and her scores on written examinations consistently ranked in the top 5% of her class. However, the practical training components that required access to specialized equipment and facilities were becoming increasingly difficult to complete, creating gaps in her transcript that could be used to justify excluding her from advanced programs regardless of her obvious intellectual capabilities. The psychological warfare intensified during Elena's 5th week at the academy, when she discovered that her personal belongings had been tampered with in ways designed to create doubt and paranoia. Her grandfather's flight logs, which she kept in a locked footlocker beneath her dormitory bed, had been subtly rearranged, with pages slightly out of order and bookmark ribbons moved to different positions. Nothing was stolen or damaged, but the clear evidence that someone had been examining her most treasured possessions felt like a violation that went beyond academic or professional harassment. Elena's roommate, Victoria Sterling, expressed exaggerated concern about the incident while managing to imply that Elena might have misremembered how she had organized her materials. "I'm sure it's nothing serious," Victoria said with false sympathy. "But you should probably be more careful about security procedures. The Academy takes very seriously any issues related to the handling of historical documents, especially ones that might contain sensitive information about military operations." The suggestion that Elena's grandfather's personal flight logs might somehow represent a security risk was both insulting and threatening, implying that her family background made her a potential security threat who required additional scrutiny and suspicion. Elena realized that Victoria was following a script designed to make her feel isolated and paranoid, while creating pretexts for additional surveillance and harassment. Elena's response was to document everything meticulously, photographing her belongings before and after each absence from her dormitory room, and maintaining detailed logs of every incident that seemed suspicious or deliberately obstructive. She also began carrying her grandfather's compass with her at all times, unwilling to risk having it tampered with or used against her in some way that could damage her standing at the academy. The harassment campaign reached a new level of sophistication. During Elena's 6th week, when she began experiencing technical difficulties during computer-based training exercises that required precise timing and coordination, her login credentials would mysteriously expire in the middle of important assessments, forcing her to restart complex simulations and lose hours of progress on critical assignments. Network connections would become unreliable during online examinations, causing her responses to be submitted incompletely or not at all. When Elena reported these technical problems to the information technology support staff, she was told that the Academy's computer systems were functioning normally and that user errors were the most likely explanation for her difficulties. Support technicians suggested that she might benefit from additional training in basic computer operations, a recommendation that was both condescending and potentially damaging to her academic record if it became part of her official file. Elena's computer science background from her preparatory studies made it clear that the problems she was experiencing were not the result of user error, but rather deliberate interference with her access credentials and network connections. Someone with administrative privileges was sabotaging her technical training in ways that would be difficult to prove, but easy to attribute to personal inadequacy or lack of technical competence. Tyler Washington, who had become Elena's closest ally and confidant at the Academy, began monitoring her computer sessions when possible and confirmed that the technical difficulties she described were real and systematic rather than coincidental. Tyler's own background in computer programming allowed him to identify some of the specific methods being used to interfere with Elena's access, but documenting these incidents in ways that would be accepted as evidence by Academy authorities proved extremely difficult. "They're being very careful," Tyler explained during one of their evening study sessions in the library. "Whoever is doing this has high-level access to the Academy's computer systems, and they know exactly how to cause problems that look like routine technical glitches rather than deliberate sabotage." Elena felt a growing sense of frustration and helplessness as she realized that her tormentors possessed not only the authority to exclude her from training opportunities, but also the technical expertise to undermine her academic performance in ways that were virtually impossible to prove or combat through official channels. The Academy's normal grievance procedures were designed to address obvious violations of policy rather than sophisticated campaigns of psychological warfare that operated within the letter of institutional rules while violating their spirit completely. The exclusion tactics became more blatant during Elena's 7th week when she arrived at the Academy's fitness facility for her scheduled physical training assessment to find that her access card had been deactivated due to administrative processing delays that couldn't be resolved until the following week. Physical fitness scores were a critical component of the overall evaluation system used to determine eligibility for advanced training programs, and missing scheduled assessments could have serious consequences for her military career prospects. Elena's attempts to resolve the access card problem through normal administrative channels were met with bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to prevent timely resolution rather than to address legitimate technical issues. Forms had to be filed in triplicate, supervisors were unavailable for approval, and processing times were extended due to unusual circumstances that were never clearly explained or justified. Meanwhile, Elena observed other cadets experiencing no similar difficulties with their access credentials or assessment schedules. Victoria Sterling and her associates moved through the Academy's facilities and programs with seamless efficiency, encountering none of the administrative obstacles that seemed to plague Elena's every interaction with institutional systems and procedures. The pattern of exclusion was becoming so obvious that even cadets who weren't particularly sympathetic to Elena's situation began to notice the differential treatment she was receiving. Several classmates approached Tyler Washington privately to express concern about what they were witnessing, though none were willing to formally document their observations or testify about the discriminatory practices they had observed. "People are talking," Tyler reported during one of their clandestine meetings in the Academy Library's rarely used historical section. "They can see what's happening to you, and some of them are uncomfortable about it. But they're also afraid that speaking up will make them targets for the same kind of treatment." Elena understood her classmates' reluctance to become involved in a situation that could jeopardize their own careers and aspirations. The Academy's culture emphasized loyalty and conformity, and challenging the actions of senior faculty members required courage that most 18 and 19-year-old cadets simply didn't possess, especially when their own futures depended on maintaining positive relationships with the same authorities who were persecuting Elena. The psychological toll of constant vigilance and systematic exclusion was beginning to affect Elena's sleep patterns and overall health. She found herself waking up multiple times each night, checking to ensure that her belongings hadn't been disturbed and reviewing her notes to make sure she hadn't missed any important announcements or assignment changes. The stress was interfering with her ability to concentrate during lectures and study sessions, creating a downward spiral that threatened to vindicate Mitchell's assertions about her unsuitability for military aviation. Elena's response was to intensify her focus on physical fitness and mental discipline, using the techniques her grandfather had described in his flight logs for maintaining psychological equilibrium during combat operations. She began each day with meditation exercises that centered her mind and prepared her for whatever challenges she would face. And she ended each day by reviewing her accomplishments and maintaining perspective about her long-term goals, rather than getting overwhelmed by immediate difficulties. The compass that had belonged to her grandfather became an increasingly important source of strength and guidance during this period of intensive harassment. Elena would hold the brass instrument during her evening meditation sessions, focusing on its steady directional bearing as a reminder that some things remained constant and reliable, even when everything else seemed designed to create confusion and doubt. As Elena approached the end of her 7th week at the academy, she realized that the pattern of exclusion she was experiencing represented something more significant than simple personal prejudice or individual bias. The systematic nature of the harassment suggested a coordinated effort involving multiple faculty members and administrative staff, all working together to create conditions that would force her to quit or fail out of the academy without creating obvious evidence of discriminatory treatment. The realization was both frightening and clarifying. Elena understood that she was fighting not just for her own dreams and aspirations, but for the principle that merit should matter more than background in determining who gets the opportunity to serve their country in positions of responsibility and leadership. The stakes had become larger than her personal success or failure, and that understanding gave her access to reserves of determination and courage that she hadn't known she possessed. The harassment campaign against Elena Rodriguez entered a dangerous new phase during her 8th week at the academy, when Colonel Mitchell decided that subtle exclusion tactics were insufficient to achieve his goal of forcing her withdrawal from the institution. The escalation began with Elena's assignment to a special assessment flight simulation exercise that was supposedly designed to evaluate her progress and identify areas where additional training might be beneficial. Unlike the standard simulation sessions that all cadets completed as part of their regular curriculum, Elena's special assessment was scheduled for late evening hours when the simulation laboratory would be largely empty and normal supervision procedures would be relaxed. She was instructed to report to Simulation Bay 7 at 2,100 hours for what Mitchell described as an intensive evaluation session that would provide her with personalized feedback about her performance and potential. Elena felt uneasy about the unusual scheduling and isolation of this assessment, but she also understood that refusing to participate would be interpreted as evidence of her unwillingness to accept additional training and guidance. Mitchell had positioned the exercise as an opportunity for her to demonstrate improvement in the areas where he claimed she had shown deficiencies during previous evaluations, making it impossible for Elena to decline without seeming uncooperative or defensive. Tyler Washington expressed serious concerns about the irregular nature of Elena's assessment when she informed him about the evening appointment during their afternoon study session. His father's military background had taught him to recognize situations where normal protocols were being bypassed for reasons that might not be in the best interests of the personnel involved. "This doesn't feel right," Tyler said, his voice reflecting genuine worry about Elena's safety and well-being. Special assessments are normally conducted during regular hours with multiple faculty members present for objective evaluation. The fact that Mitchell wants you alone in the simulation lab after normal operations have ended suggests that he's planning something that he doesn't want witnesses to observe. Elena shared Tyler's concerns, but she also felt trapped by the circumstances Mitchell had created. Refusing to participate in the assessment would provide him with documentation that could be used to justify more serious disciplinary actions, while participating exposed her to whatever Mitchell had planned for the isolated evening session. "I have to do it," Elena replied, though her voice reflected her own apprehension about the situation. "If I don't show up, Mitchell will claim that I'm avoiding evaluation because I know my performance is inadequate. That gives him grounds for formal disciplinary action that could get me dismissed from the academy." Tyler insisted on accompanying Elena to the simulation laboratory, claiming that he needed to complete some maintenance work on equipment in an adjacent facility. Elena was grateful for his proximity, even though she understood that Tyler's presence in a nearby building wouldn't necessarily protect her from whatever Mitchell had planned for their private session. Elena arrived at Simulation Bay 7 precisely at 2100 hours, carrying her grandfather's compass in her flight suit pocket and mentally reviewing the emergency procedures she had memorized for various types of aircraft malfunctions. The simulation laboratory was eerily quiet compared to its normal daytime bustle, with only emergency lighting illuminating the corridors and most of the advanced equipment shut down for overnight maintenance cycles. Colonel Mitchell was waiting for Elena in the simulation bay, along with 2 teaching assistants whose presence was supposedly required for proper documentation of the assessment session. Elena recognized both assistants as members of Victoria Sterling's social circle, young men whose family connections had given them teaching positions despite their limited experience and qualifications. "Good evening, Miss Rodriguez," Mitchell said with exaggerated formality that somehow managed to sound more threatening than welcoming. "I appreciate your dedication in participating in this additional training opportunity. Tonight's session will focus on emergency procedures and crisis decision-making, areas where your previous performance has indicated room for significant improvement." Elena nodded professionally and began her pre-flight inspection of the simulation equipment, noting several irregularities in the standard configuration that suggested the exercise had been modified in ways that weren't immediately apparent. The emergency oxygen system controls had been repositioned, the communication equipment settings had been altered, and several backup systems that normally operated automatically had been switched to manual control mode. "Is there something different about tonight's simulation configuration?" Elena asked, gesturing toward the modified control panels. "Some of these systems appear to be set up differently than during our previous training sessions." Mitchell's smile was thin and predatory as he explained that tonight's exercise was designed to test Elena's ability to adapt to non-standard equipment configurations that she might encounter during real-world flight operations. "Military pilots must be prepared to fly aircraft that have been damaged or modified under field conditions," he said. "This simulation will evaluate your ability to maintain aircraft control when normal systems are unavailable or unreliable." Elena understood that Mitchell's explanation was technically plausible, while also providing cover for equipment modifications that could create dangerous or impossible situations during the simulation exercise. She had no choice but to proceed with the assessment, but she also made mental notes about the specific alterations she had observed so that she could document them later if necessary. As Elena strapped herself into the simulation cockpit and began the standard pre-flight checklist, she noticed additional irregularities in the system responses that suggested the exercise had been programmed to create cascading failures rather than realistic training scenarios. The oxygen flow indicators showed normal readings despite the physical evidence that the delivery system had been tampered with, and several critical warning lights were disabled despite showing active status on the control panel displays. The simulation exercise began normally, with Elena demonstrating competent aircraft handling during standard flight maneuvers that were well within her capabilities. Her performance was smooth and professional, showing none of the hesitation or uncertainty that Mitchell had fabricated during his previous evaluations. For the first 15 minutes of the session, Elena felt confident that she was successfully meeting the assessment criteria despite the unusual equipment configuration. The crisis began when Mitchell introduced what he described as a routine emergency scenario involving simulated engine failure at high altitude. Elena responded immediately with textbook procedures for single-engine operation, maintaining aircraft control while following established protocols for emergency landing preparation. Her actions were precise and appropriate, demonstrating exactly the kind of competence and composure that military aviation demanded. However, the simulation's response to Elena's emergency procedures was completely unrealistic. with multiple systems failing simultaneously in ways that violated basic principles of aircraft design and engineering. As Elena attempted to compensate for the cascading malfunctions, she realized that the exercise had been programmed to create an unwinnable situation where correct responses would lead to additional system failures rather than successful emergency management. The oxygen delivery system, which Elena had noticed was modified before the exercise began, started producing reduced flow rates that made concentration and precise motor control increasingly difficult. The effect was subtle at first, creating symptoms that could be attributed to stress or fatigue rather than deliberate sabotage, but it progressively worsened until Elena was experiencing genuine hypoxia that threatened her ability to maintain consciousness and continue the simulation. Elena's training in emergency procedures included recognition of hypoxia symptoms, and she immediately reached for the emergency oxygen controls that should have restored normal breathing gas to the cockpit. However, the modified system configuration meant that these backup controls had been disabled or rerouted in ways that prevented them from functioning properly. Elena found herself trapped in a simulation exercise that was becoming genuinely life-threatening, rather than merely challenging. As Elena's vision began to blur from oxygen deprivation, she could hear Colonel Mitchell's voice through the communication system, calmly asking her to continue with the emergency procedures despite the obvious evidence that something was seriously wrong with the simulation equipment. His tone was professional and concerned, creating audio documentation that would support his later claims that Elena had simply failed to perform adequately under pressure. Elena's grandfather's compass, resting in her flight suit pocket, seemed to grow warm against her leg as her oxygen-starved brain struggled to maintain focus and coordination. The sensation reminded her of the stories her grandfather had told about maintaining consciousness during high-altitude combat operations, and she drew on those family memories to find reserves of strength and determination that allowed her to continue functioning despite the deliberately created crisis. Using techniques she had learned from studying her grandfather's flight logs, Elena began systematic troubleshooting of the simulation's life support systems, bypassing the normal controls that had been sabotaged and accessing backup systems through alternative command sequences. Her actions were desperate and improvised, but they were also informed by deep understanding of aircraft systems that allowed her to identify workarounds for the problems Mitchell had created. Elena's successful restoration of proper oxygen flow to the simulation cockpit prevented what could have been a medical emergency that might have resulted in serious injury or death. However, her ability to overcome Mitchell's sabotage also demonstrated technical knowledge and problem-solving capabilities that exceeded what was expected from first-year cadets, potentially exposing the sophisticated nature of the trap that had been set for her. As Elena regained full consciousness and alertness, she realized that Mitchell and his teaching assistants were documenting her performance difficulties and inappropriate responses to emergency situations without acknowledging the equipment malfunctions that had created the crisis. The official record would show that Elena had struggled with a routine training exercise, while omitting any mention of the life-threatening conditions that had actually occurred. "Interesting session, Miss Rodriguez," Mitchell said as Elena completed the simulation shutdown procedures, his tone suggesting disappointment rather than relief at her survival. "Your response to emergency conditions showed some concerning patterns that we'll need to address through additional training and counseling. Tonight's exercise has provided valuable insights into areas where your preparation may be inadequate for the demands of military aviation." Elena felt a surge of anger at Mitchell's blatant misrepresentation of what had occurred during the simulation, but she also understood that challenging his account directly would only provide him with additional evidence that could be used against her. Instead, she focused on documenting the specific equipment malfunctions she had observed and the methods she had used to overcome them, creating her own record of the evening's events that could potentially be used to expose Mitchell's misconduct. As Elena left the simulation laboratory, she felt shaken by the realization that Mitchell was willing to create genuinely dangerous situations in his effort to force her out of the academy. The evening's exercise had gone far beyond psychological harassment or bureaucratic obstruction, representing a level of malicious intent that could have resulted in serious physical harm. Tyler Washington was waiting for Elena outside the simulation building, his presence providing welcome reassurance after the traumatic experience she had just endured. His expression reflected his concern about what had occurred during the assessment session, and Elena realized that he had been monitoring the situation from his position in the adjacent facility. "What happened in there?" Tyler asked as they walked toward the dormitory complex, his voice reflecting genuine worry about Elena's condition and well-being. "I could hear unusual activity through the ventilation systems, and the building's emergency monitoring equipment showed irregularities in the life support systems that shouldn't occur during normal simulation operations." Elena described the evening's events in detail, emphasizing the equipment modifications she had observed and the life-threatening conditions that had been created through deliberate sabotage rather than routine training scenarios. Tyler's technical background allowed him to understand the significance of Elena's observations and the sophisticated level of knowledge that would have been required to create such dangerous conditions. "This has gone way beyond harassment," Tyler said with conviction that reflected his own outrage at what Elena had experienced. "Mitchell is committing serious crimes that could result in court-martial and imprisonment if they can be properly documented and prosecuted. We need to find a way to gather evidence that will expose what he's doing before he escalates to even more dangerous levels." Elena felt grateful for Tyler's support and technical expertise, but she also understood that gathering evidence against a senior faculty member would require resources and authority that they didn't possess as first-year cadets. Mitchell's position gave him access to advanced equipment and administrative systems that could be used to cover up his misconduct while creating additional obstacles for anyone attempting to investigate his actions. As Elena prepared for bed that night, she held her grandfather's compass and reflected on the courage that had sustained her through the evening's crisis. The brass instrument had somehow provided her with access to reserves of strength and knowledge that had allowed her to survive Mitchell's attempt to destroy her through deliberately created danger. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.